Ashley Smith is our first speaker. Ashley wonderfully agreed to step in at the very last minute because Michael Schwartz was taken with an illness. But we are very pleased to have him and very lucky to have him. He's been active in the Haiti Solidarity Movement since the 1990s. He was involved in, joined a delegation in Haiti during the U.S. occupation in 1994. He's on the executive board of the International Socialist Review. He's written for Counterpunch and ZNet, spoken to numerous conferences about U.S. imperialism, its impact in Haiti, as well as Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Palestine. He also participates in many anti-war formations, including the National Assembly, against the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and occupations. Ashley Smith.
Well, I'm going to be speaking about blood and oil, which Michael Schwartz has written a great deal about. And, you know, it's a topic that will make you angry and hopefully warm you up with the desire to change the world in this very cold day that we're meeting on. I remember we invited Howard Zinn, a lot of Vermont anti-war activists, to speak at the very beginning of the war in Afghanistan. And he said something very profound, which is that governments always lie. They always lie to us because they have to get us to believe what a minority only benefits from. But sometimes the people who run our society actually tell the truth. Alan Greenspan, in his book, The Age of Turbulence, admitted that he was saddened that it is politically inconvenient to acknowledge what everyone knows. The Iraq War is largely about oil. So finally, somebody actually told the truth in Washington, D.C. Greenspan spilled the beans and said the obvious, that the Iraq War was really all about oil from the very beginning. In reality, the entire global war on terror is a cover for U.S. imperialism's attempt to seize control of strategic energy reserves in Central Asia and the Middle East. Bush screwed up this project profoundly with disastrous interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan that turned the population of the world against what the United States was doing. And that really brought Barack Obama to power when he won the election just a little over a year ago. And many people had hopes and expectations that Obama was going to reverse the policies of the Bush administration. In reality, the establishment that did back Obama had him an assignment to rehabilitate the very same project that the Bush administration had been engaged in and had screwed up so profoundly. And Obama really has continued it, as I'll lay it out. That's why he's planning to maintain an ongoing occupation in Iraq, despite the drawdown of troops, has escalated the U.S. war in Afghanistan, and has his sights now set on Yemen. And I'll go through what is going on in each of those cases. At the heart of this project is a geopolitical battle in each area for control of the world's most important commodity, oil. One of the U.S. central priorities right now is the military and economic domination of these resources in competition with rivals, particularly China and Russia. Oil and natural gas are finite resources, and a consensus has developed that oil in particular will in the coming years hit a peak of its production. The coincidence of peak oil and rising demand from countries like China, among others, has opened up an intense inter-imperial rivalry over energy resources. Globally, we are witnessing an intense scramble for oil and natural gas to fuel the world's economic powers. The U.S., as Michael Clare argues, has adopted a policy of maximum extraction of oil and natural gas. It wants to seize control of the key accessible reserves through political influence, direct ownership, or military intervention to pressure states with the bulk of easily accessible reserves in the Middle East or Central Asia to supply the U.S. and the world economy. But they are battling their rivals for every drop of oil, from Venezuela, where they have attempted to topple Hugo Chavez, to Africa, where they are scrambling to open up every spigot from Nigeria to the Sudan. As Michael Clare writes, the American military is being more and more used for the protection of overseas oil fields and supply routes that connect them to the United States and its allies. Such endeavors, once largely confined to the Gulf area, are now being extended to unstable oil regions in other parts of the world. Slowly but surely, the U.S. military is being converted into a global oil protection service. There is no doubt that the imperial domination over these reserves drives the U.S. policy in the global war on terror. The war and occupation of Afghanistan opened up Central Asia and its countries to U.S. bases so it could seize control over Caspian Sea oil and natural gas reserves, which are the largest newly discovered oil and natural gas fields in the world. The Afghan war, as Christian Parenti argued in the International Socialist Review, was also a gateway to the U.S. seizing control over Iraq and its oil reserves, which are purported to be the second largest in the world behind Saudi Arabia. By controlling those reserves, which are exported mainly to Europe and Asia, the U.S. can lock in its dominance over energy-dependent rising rivals like China and prevent a petrobloc coming together around its other principal rival, Russia. In other words, U.S. imperialism's drive for control of oil is not simply for its own consumption, but more importantly for domination over potential imperial rivals. However, and this is important to underscore, the focus on oil for U.S. imperialism is nothing new. It is not unique to the Republican Party, and it is not the result of dependence or scarcity. This helps explain the continuity of U.S. behavior regardless of which corporate party has been in power, whether the Democrats or the Republicans. There's been fundamental continuity over U.S. aims to dominate the energy reserves of the planet. It begins all the way back with the discovery of the Middle Eastern oil reserves in the early 20th century, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared in 1943, defense of Saudi Arabia is vital to the defense of the United States. He met with King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud in 1945 to promise U.S. protection for the reactionary regime, which continues down to this day. President Truman's State Department declared the aims of the U.S. very clearly, stating, "In Saudi Arabia, the oil resources constitute a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in human history." That prize was not for direct U.S. consumption, which at that point was provided almost entirely by domestic energy resources, but really it was about profits for U.S. oil companies and global domination. Whoever controlled those reserves, which are so vital for the world economy, controlled the entire planet. So through the entire Cold War, whether under Democrats or Republicans, the U.S. designed its policy in the Middle East around control over these energy reserves and also to prevent Russia's empire from gaining control and unfettered access to the reserves. And they also confronted a real problem within the Middle East, that of Arab nationalist regimes that wanted to control their own countries' oil reserves. So in effect, in reaction to these two potential challenges, Arab nationalism and Russia, the U.S. produced a whole series of doctrines, the presidential doctrines, the Truman Doctrine, the Eisenhower Doctrine, the Kennedy Doctrine, and the Nixon Doctrine, which were all designed to prevent Russia from getting into the Middle East and to put down Arab nationalist regimes that would challenge U.S. control over the area. In just two prominent examples, the U.S. aided coups that overthrew key figures that were challenging U.S. energy dominance. A coup against the nationalist Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran and the Iraqi nationalist Abdul Karim Qasim in 1963. The U.S. thus built an informal empire in the Middle East of client regimes. It sustained the Saudi monarchy, the police state led by the Shah of Iran, various reactionary regimes in Iraq, and especially its local sheriff in the region, Israel. These states, especially Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Israel, formed the basis of U.S. dominion against Arab nationalism and in competition with Russia. While Israel has no oil or natural gas reserves, it has served as America's key agent in the region, willing to do the dirty work for the U.S. Thus, the U.S. has backed Israel in all its wars against Arab nationalist regimes and has supported its dispossession of Palestinians, because the rising of Palestinians threatens to undo all the client regimes that the U.S. supports in the area. But U.S. policy in the Middle East really came to a crossroads at the turn of the millennium. They had lost the Shah of Iran. Their containment of Iraq and Iran had begun to fall apart, and Israel was the last remaining sheriff in the region. And the U.S. had become dependent on the Middle Eastern energy resources and all foreign oil for the first time. So the U.S. had to come up with a new strategy, not only because its past policies had failed, but also because the U.S. had become dependent, as I said, for its oil for the first time in 1998. With domestic reserves producing declining amounts of oil, the U.S. now had to ensure access and increase productivity of its foreign sources of oil to meet its ever-increasing demands. These factors drove George Bush II to fuse national security with energy policy. It issued a new national energy policy months before September 11th that advocated increased domestic production in new sites like the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve, diversification of foreign sources of energy, investment of alternative sources of energy, and finally, and most importantly, projection of U.S. power throughout the world to control and protect oil wells and pipelines. The U.S. was unable to meet its rising demand for oil through domestic drilling or through foreign oil reserves outside of the Middle East. Anwar and other domestic sources will simply not be able to meet the demands for energy in the United States. Moreover, given the rising energy demands of oil-producing nations like Venezuela or Mexico, they will not be able to export enough oil to meet U.S. needs. Therefore, the Bush National Energy Policy document concluded, by any estimation, Middle East oil production will remain central to world oil security. As a result, they argued, the Gulf will be a primary focus of U.S. international energy policy. Hence, the Iraq War, which was supposed to be for Bush the opening gambit of regime change throughout the Middle East to install client regimes that would open up the oil wells so that they could increase the productivity of oil production in the entire region. And as we know, Bush's military policy ended up producing a profound catastrophe. Iraq and Afghanistan went terribly wrong for the Bush administration, discredited U.S. imperialism, and they were unable to conduct the rolling regime changes to secure dominance of oil in both the Middle East and Central Asia. And that's where Obama comes in, really. Obama has changed the rhetoric, attempted to win back alienated allies in Europe, and calm tensions with potential rivals like China and Russia. But a lot of this is smoke screens, really, to disguise his administration's pursuit of the very same goals that Bush pursued. Given the stakes of the international battle for energy, the new administration has continued U.S. imperial struggles for oil. Hence Obama's hawkish stance on Afghanistan. The journalist Pepe Escobar calls the region Pipelanistan. And sure enough, the U.S. is angling for pipelines to move natural gas out of the Caspian along a corridor that bypasses Russia and Iran. Escobar argues, he's fantastic. If people haven't read Pepe Escobar, he's one of the best journalists on this. He says, "Yup, it all comes down to black gold, blue gold natural gas, hydrocarbon wealth beyond compare. And so it's time to trek back to that ever-flowing wonderland, Pipelanistan. It's time to dust off the acronyms, especially the SCO, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Asian response to NATO, and learn a few new names like IPI, the Iran-Pakistan-India Pipeline, and TAPI, T-A-P-I, the Turkmenistan-Afghanistan-Pakistan-India Pipeline. Above all, it's time to check out the most recent moves on the giant chessboard of Eurasia, where Washington wants to be a crucial, if not a dominant player. This is part of why Obama is risking such a major escalation of the war in Afghanistan and into Pakistan, to ensure U.S. control of Central Asia's energy reserves and its pipelines. To accomplish this, the U.S. must impose its order on client regimes in the region. This same drive for control over oil also explains Obama's expansion of the war into Yemen. The crucial importance of Yemen has nothing to do with the Christmas underpants bomber, just to set that to rest. The crucial importance of Yemen to geopolitics is the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at Yemen's southwest corner, a strategic choke point for ships, including oil tankers passing through the Gulf of Aden to the Red Sea and the Suez Canal to the north. Moreover, Yemen has vital oil deposits in the south that the U.S. fears could get out of its control to a secessionist movement. So the U.S. is backing the utterly reactionary Saleh regime to control the strait and maintain its dominance and access to the oil reserves in the south of the country. The U.S. under Obama will thus continue to shed massive amounts of blood for oil. Oil is the lifeblood of the system. Without it, the capitalist system itself would grind to a halt. Facing a peak oil and rising inter-imperial competition for the resource, we will only see more oil wars, more gas wars in the coming years. Given the increasing competition in a war-torn world, in a crisis-torn world economy, we can expect these battles, whether over resources or not, to heat up. Oil may be a trigger, but the system itself is the cause. That's why we have to oppose their oil wars as part of a struggle to transform the whole system and finally make the shedding of blood for oil and empire a sad tale from a barbaric past.
Our next speaker is Adaner Usmani. He works with the Labour Party of Pakistan. He's a member of Action for a Progressive Pakistan. And with these and other groups, he's been involved in anti-war work, as well as assorted campaigns for peasant and worker rights in Pakistan. He's going to tell us the real story on the ground in Pakistan, the result of the U.S. Drones and pressures and destabilization campaign there, and prepare us to educate our friends and co-workers about the real U.S. impact and aims in Pakistan.
I'm going to start with what I think is the heart of my argument and what I want to convey, and then try and work backwards in a sense, and whatever gets left out then we can address in the discussion. So I want to say that contrary to what has been popularized in the media and in policy circles and in things like this, and I mean the well-traveled argument that Pakistan is a failed state, or it's a failing state, or it's about to fail, that the Taliban are at the gates of civilized Pakistan and things like this, I want to insist as a starting point for our discussion that we understand that the country is not, in fact, on the verge of collapsing to the 10 to 20,000 militants based in different districts of its northwesternmost regions. So that's the northwestern frontier province and the federally administered tribal areas, which actually you can probably better see on the second map. The geographic and mathematical ignorance, arithmetical ignorance that this claim entails is quite staggering. I mean, Pakistan is the sixth most populous country in the world, and unfortunately has its 7th largest army. So I hope you don't need much convincing that this claim was and is quite clearly baseless propaganda that was mobilized to justify the expansion of the US and Pakistani military offensives in the region. And I make this point also, I want to stress this, I make this point not in order to underplay the threat of militant or religious militancy in the country. But I want to emphasize it because the struggle against fundamentalism in Pakistan, which is certainly a critical obligation for the left here and at home, can only be properly conceived if we appreciate the complex historical and political and social context of the current conjuncture and of the emergence of militancy. So what I want to emphasize instead is that when you look at Pakistan and its recent political scene, the most dangerous effect of Obama's long war is not the fact of the existence of the Pakistani Taliban within our borders. Rather, what ails the country the most, and especially its progressive circles, is the fact that the war on terror, both the American iteration in Afghanistan and the homegrown equivalent, which has taken the form of 3 very major military offensives in the Northwest and also minor offensives that are still ongoing, that all of that has restored the Pakistani military to center stage of Pakistan's political scene. And this, tragically, is actually a position that, as some of you know, is a position which it's quite used to occupying. That's actually the, can we go to the third, maybe? I have a brief timeline which might help, but it's down a little bit. Anyway, so in the brief time that I have to speak, I want to do 3 things. First, I want to quickly trace the origins of, up there. Anyway, the bold periods are periods of military rule. I want to quickly trace the origins of the enormous influence of the Pakistani state and security apparatus to the early history of the country and to the relationship with the United States. The second thing I want to do is emphasize the three things that I think are most important to a left understanding of the war on terror as it pertains to what is unfolding within Pakistan. And the third thing I want to do is very quickly speak about what I see as the burden confronting progressive forces in the country. So first, and I don't think I'm going to get through all of this, but first then I want to do the history of the Pakistani state in 5 minutes or less. So as you can see from the slide, more than half of Pakistan's history has been spent under military rule. The obvious question is why? There's too much almost to say. In part, the nature of the Pakistani state is a legacy of our inheritance. The British bequeathed us an administrative and security apparatus that was centralized and rooted in the loyalty of native ruling elites, but not at all in the political aspirations of the mass of the population. One must also, and can we go to the next one? So this is a map of India in 1948, or 1947 maybe. So one must also appreciate, and this is the second point about why the military has emerged, or why the central state plays such a strong role in Pakistan's political life. One must also appreciate the bankruptcy of the political formation that led Pakistan to independence in 1947. This was the Pakistan Muslim League, headed by our founding father, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, which, and this is a quote from a Pakistani social scientist, which failed until the very eve of the partition to draw any substantial support in the Muslim majority provinces, which were later to constitute the state of Pakistan. The solid base of support for the Muslim League for most of its history, especially until 1946 at the very least, lay in the Muslim minority provinces of India, which are the UP and Bihar, which I'm not sure if, actually it'll be impossible to read it, but they're not what makes Pakistan today, basically. In the other half of what is today Pakistan, Balochistan and the Northwest Frontier Province, the Muslim Leaguers had absolutely no support whatsoever. So they made these alliances at the eve of partition with landlord parties, essentially in the Sindh and the Punjab. But in the other parts of what are now Pakistan, and I'm not even talking about East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh in 1971 after a very horrific genocide launched by the Pakistani military. But in Balochistan, in the Northwest Frontier Province, the Pakistan Muslim League had no support whatsoever. Balochistan, in fact, declared its independence a day after Pakistan did on August 14th. They declared their independence on August 15th, 1947, but were forced to accede to the Federation in April 1948. The Northwest Frontier Province, now home to the Taliban, then housed a dynamic, non-violent freedom movement which was allied to the Indian National Congress and not the Muslim League. To make a long story very, very short, the onset of military rule in 1958 can be explained by this colossal political failure. To quote Tariq Ali, and this is an old Tariq Ali. Tariq Ali actually wrote a very excellent book that I think people should read if they have a chance, called Can Pakistan Survive? It was written in the early 80s, I think, or maybe late 70s. Early 80s, I think. Anyway, so he says the bureaucrats, the military officers, and their American advisors considered that a general election, which had been scheduled for 1959, based on adult franchise, was far too risky an enterprise because it simply didn't have roots in the population. And I want to briefly cash out this last part about the American advisors, since it's, I think, most important for us at a meeting of the American anti-war movement. As many of you know, historically, the US government has backed the forces of reaction in Pakistan to the hilt against the people of the country. The reasons, I think, are very well known. In the post-World War II world, Pakistan quickly became a willing satrap, joining the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization in 1954, signing the anti-Nasserite Baghdad Pact a year later, readily recognizing American client regimes in South Korea and South Vietnam, even condoning the Anglo-French-Israeli invasion of Egypt in 1956 until the Americans expressed their opposition themselves. So our ruling classes, decisively compromised in the eyes of their own population, have prostrated themselves before the United States to their own enrichment and political benefit. Moreover, what's important for us here, but should come as no surprise, is the well-known fact that this close relationship has thrived particularly during that half of our existence that we have spent under the thumb of the military. So in 1957, the Committee on Foreign Relations described the Pakistani military as, quote, the greatest single stabilizing force in the country. This came only a year before our first coup, which would be led by Ayub Khan. The same Ayub Khan who would justify his dictatorship on the grounds that, and this is classic, quote, democracy cannot work in a hot climate. To have democracy, we must have a cold climate, as in Britain. So the history behind the excessively centralized nature of the state is critical to understanding the political situation that prevails in Pakistan today. For one, because political power has been concentrated at the center, the provincial question is alive in effect in every corner of our country. Most notably, again, in the province of Balochistan, where the military has been deployed on 5 separate occasions since 1948. And there are estimates, and I don't know exactly when this estimate begins from, but it's quite recent. There are estimates that some, I think the Musharraf era, there are estimates that some 7,000 people have been disappeared by our security establishment in recent years, and most of those are Balochis. Okay, so let's move to, that was the first point. So let's move to numbers 2 and 3. How much time do I have? 7? Oh, 7 minutes? Okay. The second point, yeah, okay, so the second point is I want to list the 3 things that I think are important to stress when thinking about the Taliban and the war on terror in Pakistan. The first thing is that people have to understand that the Pakistan military itself has been integral to the networks of patronage that have built the ideological and material infrastructure for militancy in the region. People, I think, know the story about the 80s and cooperation between Reagan and Zia-ul-Haq, so I'm going to skip that. But they're quite clearly and rationally, actually, from their perspective, in league with elements of the Afghan Taliban, as we know. Even in the case of the different groups that make up the Pakistani Taliban. And the Pakistani Taliban is a group that's actually distinct from the Afghan Taliban. And it came together in December, I think, 2007, on a platform of, they were opposed, obviously, to the American presence in Afghanistan, but they also believed, because the Pakistani state was cooperating with the Americans in Afghanistan, that they had an obligation to fight the Pakistani state as well. So they came together on this platform in December 2007. But even in the case of the different groups that make up the Pakistani Taliban, the opposition of the Pakistani military is actually quite inconsistent over time and place. There are at least 3 different groups that they've made peace deals with or had relations with and things like this. So the notion that this is some kind of war on the ideology represented by the Taliban or a war on these groups because of what they represent is simply fallacious. It's just because certain groups serve their strategic interest and certain groups don't. The second point I want to make is that the Taliban have actually come to stand in for the Talibanization of Pakistani society, which is meant to be a term that speaks about urban conservatism and things like this, general religious conservatism in the society. But urban conservatism, which is undoubtedly on the rise, is basically unrelated, I want to argue, to the insurgencies in the Northwest. There are pro-war leftists, who I'm sure you've read, who have invoked the specter of religious bigotry at large in the society to mobilize support for the state's offensives in the Northwest. When I was in Karachi last year, I heard one feminist screech about how Karachi used to have discos and now there are no discos, hence the war is justified. But outsourcing our struggle to the state, which is anyway in league with some of the most noxious political formations in Pakistan, not to mention currently engaged in repressing a liberation movement in Balochistan, will not advance secular, tolerant, or emancipatory politics in the slightest. And I think this is a lesson that we're also learning about from Afghanistan. Third point I want to make is that the vast majority of militants who fight the Pakistani state, I would argue, have grievances that push them to violence. Aside from the fact that many foot soldiers have surely picked up arms in response to the extremely heavy-handed military operations, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard about mass displacement in response to these operations and things like this. These are also areas of endemic poverty, underemployment, infrastructure deprivation, and a draconian legal and political apparatus. And then there's the small matter of the neo-colonial occupation to the north, which, needless to say, fuels much of this as well. And military operations on top of that can solve none of these problems. For example, the first major offensive, which was in Bajor, was launched in August 2008. Mission accomplished was declared in February 2009. Yet the military is still, to this day, launching repeated regular search and destroy missions in the area. The third point I want to make, a few points about the situation confronting the left in Pakistan. As in many other countries around the world, Pakistan's economy has hit the skids in the course of the last crisis. Before this, at least 2 decades of privatizations and structural adjustment had compounded a sordid legacy of underdevelopment from the colonial era. Some 85% of the population lives on less than $2 a day. Additionally, the food crisis has hit the peasantry and the working classes particularly severely. And I actually have a graph that I have. Can we go to the last one? There's a food inflation graph. I did some research on food inflation in the province of Sindh. I think below, yeah. So the announced food inflation, or the official food inflation in Pakistan from this period, which is August 2007 to August 2008, I think was something like 33%. But when we went to these villages and collected data, it looked it looked, especially in the very important commodity, which was flour, that inflation across, I think this is 15 or 16 villages, was actually much, much higher. I think, it's above 100% or something like that. So the government is going to be paying back, a massive IMF bailout package starting in 2011 to 2012. Altogether, it represents some $11 billion at 3 to 4% interest. Already in anticipation, austerity and retrenchment have arrived. For one, electricity subsidies have been cut, and this is one of the conditions, meaning a condition of the loan, meaning an anticipated increase of some 50% in consumer bills. Social welfare spending is down. Just this past Wednesday, the federal cabinet announced that it was slashing the social sector budget by 30% and shifting that money towards security expenditure. Much more is in store, I think, including, of course, the high likelihood of another agreement with the IMF to rescue us, and this is a familiar story, from the debt that we incurred in the course of the present agreement with the IMF. As is true elsewhere, I think the task of resisting this will fall to the left. The only force, the only type of politics that has a substantive, popular program of opposition to neoliberalism in this kind of madness. It is, of course, in the grips of a serious crisis in Pakistan, as elsewhere in the world. The left is. Yet, and this is what I want to leave you with in particular, the weakness of it as an organized force does not mean that there is an absence of struggle in the country. Far from it. In a country as riven with contradictions as Pakistan, it could not but be this way. The national question, again, is alive in every single corner of the country, and that I mean literally. In almost every case, it is led by overwhelmingly secular forces. There is a women's movement, a human rights movement, a labor movement, a peasants movement, a fisherfolk movement, a communist movement. As we meet here, some 30,000 workers and peasants have gathered in Faisalabad in Punjab to discuss the same issues that confront us. And thus, particularly as the US mobilizes the tropes of a 21st century civilizing mission in AFPAC, that we're here to liberate their women, that we're here to stabilize their democracy, that we're here even to save their children, we, the anti-war movement in the States, must insist on a simple premise. The Pakistani people have always been capable of, if not engaged in, emancipating themselves. Thank you.
If you had a car with no money in the meter outside.
Our next speaker, we are so lucky, is Glen Ford. He's a broadcast journalist, the executive director of the Black Agenda Report. He's well known as the creator of the first nationally syndicated black news interview program on commercial television. And more recently, he helped organize the Black is Back demonstration, a march on the White House which demanded an end to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, an end to U.S. military aid to Africa, and jobs and secure justice at home. Glen Ford.
I hope I'm not going to be redundant, but I guess one can never speak the truth too many times. But forgive me if I go over ground that was so very well plowed by particularly Mr. Ashley. I'm grateful to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel with the title Drive Towards Empire, End Endless War. The U.S. Imperialism is attempting to regain the initiative after the setbacks suffered under George Bush in his offensive of 2003. And I call it the offensive of 2003 because we usually refer to it as the Iraq War, but I think it has that title, the Iraq War, because it was stopped in Iraq. It was not supposed to stop in Iraq. It was a general offensive that was to begin in Iraq, and then with shock and awe, the momentum would carry the American power deep into Central Asia, the stands of the former Soviet Union, and in doing so would strategically alter the global outlines of power in the world, in the United States' favor. So it was not supposed to be an Iraq war. It was supposed to be a much bigger deal. But it was stopped by the Iraqi resistance. And we owe a deep, deep debt to the Iraqis. Now, I know that in some circles that's like back in the day saying that we favored Ho Chi Minh winning. But that was true then too. and that's how the war ended, through victory of the Vietnamese. I remember word was getting out about the extravagant contracts that they were letting out of this office in Northern Virginia to reconstruct Iraq. They were so sure that the place would be secure enough for them to just remake the whole country. They had an outline for a new city that they were going to build right next to Baghdad, and it would look very much like Houston with ranch houses. You know, they were just going to import thousands and thousands of American employees and this new class of Iraqi who would be working with them as they corporatized the country. So Rome not only was going to be relocated to Washington, but its various outposts already had zoning laws and things. It was amazing how quickly the United States projected itself into that new Rome. With these very quick American victories, public attitudes towards the war changed rather rapidly as well, because there's nothing that Americans like better than a war that they think they have won. You know? And so we saw very quickly that the anti-war sentiment dissipated. And one of the ways that one of the signals that this anti-war sentiment was dissipating came out of Chicago, where a young politician took his October 2000 anti-war speech off of his campaign website during the same week that his name appeared on the Democratic Leadership Council's membership list. And that was Barack Obama. And that was our introduction at Black Agenda Report, at that time Black Commentator, to Barack Obama. It was quite disturbing. We contacted Barack Obama to ask him, what's up with that? Why did you take, you know, we thought that was a pretty good speech. Why did you take it off? And he gave the lame excuse that, well, you know, campaign websites, you know, you put things on and you take some of them off. And it was just a very routine thing. And he said, well, what about your name showing up on the Democratic Leadership Council's list? I had no idea, said he. This was very disturbing, because if those of you who know anything about the DLC understand that that is the corporate bagman of the Democratic Party. And getting their endorsement is not to be taken lightly. They are the folks who vouch to corporate America that you are worthy of corporate contributions. So when you go through their vetting process, you know it. So this is how Barack Obama came to our attention, and it struck fear into us immediately, dread, the deepest anxiety, because we saw that he was a hell of a package, articulate, clean. What was the word? He was so attractive. We knew the blue-haired ladies would love him, and everybody would love this guy. And so he was a dangerous man, and it became apparent to us that that we could predict a future in which the black political apparatus would fold up its tents and bow out of its traditional oppositional posture behind this great black hope. And that if that happened, then there would be no possibility of a progressive response to this DLC member, ex-anti-war candidate. And that would be disastrous. And in fact, that's what came to pass. For the first time in my lifetime, we saw a presidential campaign in which black political leadership, such as it is, did not raise one single demand. Ever since 1968, every 4 years, if black leadership comes together to demand a Marshall Plan for the cities. It's reflexive. Nobody even has to write that one down. That's what you always demand. Marshall Plan for the cities. What do you want? Marshall Plan. In 2008, not even the Marshall Plan. There was a fear that to make any demand might somehow embarrass or discomfort or burden Barack Obama. And so we had a unilateral shutdown of black political activity that was not concerned directly with turning out votes for Barack Obama. That caused great confusion among the white left, which frankly takes its cues from black folks. What are the black folks doing? Okay. I think we ought to do that too. You know? And so the black folks weren't doing anything except saying rah rah for Obama, and that led to a shutdown on the white left as well. And so we had a political campaign of 2008 in which the left, black and not black, unilaterally demobilized themselves and became irrelevant to the discussion. And that could not have come at a worse time. What a trick of history. Here we enter 2008, and the capitalist system collapses. What an opportunity for a leftist, you know? Something that happens not even once in a lifetime. And we are totally demobilized. That's an opportunity that passed us by. Here we have a situation in which George Bush's failed offensive of 2003 has put U.S. imperialism in an even weaker situation than the one it was trying to extricate itself from through that 2003 offensive. And where is the left? Demobilized, saying nothing. So we missed these historical opportunities. And so I know it sounds like I'm going over old ground when we should be projecting what we're going to do tomorrow, but I don't think that the lessons of the great collapse of progressives of 2008, this self-initiated defeat, have been learned. And so they need to be talked about again. Now, when imperialism did its makeover by backing its favored candidate, who was Barack Obama, remember that the corporate America gave much more money to the Democrats in 2008 than to the Republicans. That makes 2008 an historic year, as much as the election of a black president. And of that corporate money that went to Democrats, Barack Obama got the bulk of that. So Barack Obama is the corporate choice for president. And here we find ourselves allied with the corporate choice for president. And we have not really had an examination of how did that happen? How did corporate America and black America and left America all wind up on the same side? You know, we need to examine these very recent mistakes as we make plans to go forward, you know, tomorrow and next week. Unless we purge ourselves of whatever disorders we had going on in our heads, we're going to make similar mistakes in the future. And history is not going to give us too many more opportunities to pass out collapses of capitalism and, you know, imperial setbacks on a humongous scale, you know. We just have been lucky. Here's another thing that happened in 2008 that I believe is far, far more significant for humankind than the election of a black corporate imperialist president. And that is the swallowing of the United States as a state, that is the governmental apparatus, whole by Wall Street only months after its collapse. What a hell of a phenomenon. They are on their backs, unable to perform the historical functions of great investment banks, which is to accumulate capital, some of which will go into productive enterprise. They no longer can do that. That's something that should go down in the history books as a benchmark of moving from one stage of development to something else. You know, it's somebody ought to be in the British Museum, you know, doing calculations on, you know, what does that mean? And we kind of slipped it because we were all in the Obama craze, you know. We're missing so much here. But that's what happened in 2008. According to the Inspector General for the TARP program, by July, the Obama administration and the Fed had made available to the financial sector $23.7 trillion, which is getting close to twice the gross domestic product of the United States. Now, I know that's not that's not an anti-war in the anti-war category of discussion, but yes, it is. Yes, it is. When the American state has been swallowed whole by Wall Street, when it takes almost twice the gross domestic product of the United States to shore up the ruling class, that has a direct effect on how we plan our resistance to this current imperial offensive, where the pressure points are, and where we should, the connections that we must make to the public between the war and their pocketbooks. We have to, I believe, really do some more serious work as anti-war activists on the state of the degenerate state of the capitalist economy, and make that connection quite plain to average people, because we are living in not just interesting times, but the times that will change the destiny of mankind, and we need to find ways to articulate that in our anti-war mission. And I'm out of time.